The last 72 hours of Councillor Drethvarn's life began with a vote he had been expecting for 300 years. He stood at the far end of the conclave's upper gallery, a place reserved for those whose presence was acknowledged but whose influence was understood to have passed. The gallery was carved from a single slab of pale limestone, its balustrade worn smooth by centuries of clawed hand resting upon it during sessions that decided the shape of worlds. Morning light entered through the eastern clerestory in wide, golden panels that fell across the tiered seating below, illuminating the dust motes that drifted through the chamber like small, weightless ghosts. Dreth watched them. He had been watching dust motes in this chamber for longer than most of the delegates below had been alive. The vote was on Provision 14 of the Sulvan Territorial Compact, the article that governed the treatment of unhatched clutches found on disputed land. A technical matter, the kind of provision that younger delegates dismissed as administrative housekeeping, a relic from an era when territorial boundaries between the Cathari clans were drawn by claw and fire rather than by survey drones and mineral rights arbitration. Dreth knew better. Provision 14 was a load-bearing wall. Remove it, and the building would not collapse immediately, but the weight would shift to places that were never designed to hold it, and in time the cracks would follow. The delegate proposing the amendment was a Cathari named Sulwan Oth, young by conclave standards, barely 90, her scales a deep, lustrous emerald that still caught light the way scales do before the centuries dull them. Her arguments were precise, efficient, and entirely correct in their narrow framing. The provision was outdated. Its language referenced territorial markers that no longer existed. Its enforcement mechanisms were tied to a clan arbitration system that had been dissolved 40 years ago. She had the numbers, the procedural standing, and the support of 3 of the 5 voting blocks. What she did not have was the memory of why the provision had been written. Dreth shifted his weight on the gallery rail. His body was the largest in the chamber, 17 meters from snout to tail tip, though time had compressed him. The great dorsal ridge that had once stood a full meter above his spine, now worn to a blunted crest. His scales were the color of old iron, darkened to charcoal in the deep creases between the plates, edged with a network of fine white lines where the mineral deposits of extreme age had calcified along the growth seams. His left wing hung at a permanent half-fold, the shoulder joint fused by an old fracture that no healer had been able to reverse. His right wing still folded correctly, but the membrane was thin, almost translucent in the daylight, veined with the dark tracery of blood vessels that no longer carried enough heat to sustain flight. He had not flown in 61 years. He was 412 years old. He was the last delegate who had been present when Provision 14 was drafted. And he was dying. The stone lung had been advancing for 2 decades, now calciumite crystal formations building slowly in his pleural membranes, reducing his lung capacity by fractions of a % each season. He breathed with a faint, wet rattle that he had learned to suppress during sessions by timing his exhales to the chamber's ambient noise. On quiet nights, alone in his quarters in the conclave's eastern wing, the rattle was loud enough to hear from the corridor. He had perhaps 3 seasons left, perhaps 2. The healers spoke in careful language about comfort and management, and the importance of reducing exertion, which was their way of saying that the timeline was no longer measured in years. Below, Sulwan Oth concluded her procedural summary and yielded the floor for the opposition period. Silence held for 6 heartbeats. No one rose. Dreth closed his eyes. He had known no one would rise. The opposition to this amendment had been eroding for 20 years, delegate by delegate, retirement by death by quiet reassignment. The provision's defenders had been old when Dreth was middle-aged. Now they were gone, and the institutional memory they had carried was gone with them, and what remained was a chamber full of competent legislators who understood the amendment's text perfectly, and its context not at all. He could have risen. He still had speaking rights. His voice, though diminished, still carried the subsonic register that commanded attention in a Cathari chamber, the deep harmonic that vibrated in the limestone and the bones of every delegate present, a frequency that the body recognized as authority even when the mind had moved on. He could have spoken for 20 minutes, laid out the history, explained what Provision 14 had been built to prevent, and it would have changed nothing. So when Oth had the votes, the amendment would pass. And the provision that had protected the clutches of displaced clans for 3 centuries would be replaced by a streamlined administrative protocol that was faster, cheaper, and blind to the one thing the original provision had been designed to see: kindness. The original provision had not been about territorial markers or clan arbitration. It had been about ensuring that, when a clutch was found on disputed land, eggs laid by a mother who had been driven from her territory by war or famine or political exile, those eggs were treated as lives first and property second. The provision required that a living keeper be assigned to any disputed clutch within 48 hours, that the keeper remain with the eggs regardless of the outcome of the territorial claim, and that no clutch could be relocated, recycled, or administratively disposed of while the keeper's care was ongoing. The amendment replaced the keeper requirement with an automated monitoring system, sensors, data feeds, remote oversight from a regional office staffed by technicians who would never touch the eggs, never hear the faint vibration of a heartbeat through a shell, never sit through the long nights when the temperature dropped and the eggs needed the warmth of a body nearby. The original Provision 14 had been drafted by a committee of 7. Dreth had been the youngest member. The eldest had been Matriarch Salvan herself, 700 years old at the time, blind in both eyes, her scales so white with calcification that she had resembled a statue of herself. She had dictated the keeper clause in a voice that barely rose above a whisper, and when someone on the committee had asked why a living keeper was necessary when monitoring equipment could do the same job, she had said, "Because equipment does not choose to stay." Dreth opened his eyes. The vote was proceeding. Delegates pressed their markers into the limestone tally grooves, the soft click of claw on stone echoing through the chamber in the particular rhythm that meant the outcome was not in doubt. He turned from the gallery rail and walked toward the corridor. His claws clicked against the stone in a slow, measured cadence that he had learned, over the decades, to keep steady despite the growing stiffness in his hind joints. The corridor was wide enough for his full wingspan. The conclave had been built in an era when delegates were expected to arrive by air, and the architecture still accommodated bodies that could fill a sky. Now it accommodated Dreth's careful, ground-bound walk, and the sound of his breathing, and the particular loneliness of a building designed for flight inhabited by someone who could no longer fly. He was halfway to his quarters when he heard the voice. It came from the service corridor that ran parallel to the main gallery, passage, a narrow, low-ceilinged tunnel originally designed for the conclave's maintenance workers, the small-bodied species who kept the limestone clean and the bioluminescent panels charged, and the water systems flowing. The voice was speaking a trade dialect that Dreth recognized as human-accented Ketharin, the grammar slightly compressed, the consonants rounded in the way that human mouths shaped them when they lacked the dental ridges to produce the sharp clicks. "Just need it warmer, the gel is setting too fast. If you could bring the portable heater from the storage alcove on level 3, the one with the adjustable output, I can keep the temperature stable until the maintenance crew arrives in the morning." Dreth stopped. He turned his head, a slow, deliberate motion that sent a cascade of small pains through his cervical vertebrae, and looked down the service corridor. A human woman was crouched at the junction where the service tunnel met a small utility chamber. She was perhaps 60 years old, with short gray hair and hands that showed the particular wear of someone who had spent decades doing physical work, calloused palms, a healed burn scar across the back of her left hand, fingernails trimmed to the quick. She wore the plain, unmarked tunic of the Conclave's kitchen staff, the fabric faded from repeated washing, with a name embroidered on the breast pocket in Ketharin's script that Dreth could read even from this distance. ASHA. She was speaking to a young Kethari maintenance worker, who stood in the utility chamber doorway with the slightly overwhelmed expression of someone who had been asked to solve a problem outside their usual parameters. "The heater on level 3, the maintenance worker said. "That is assigned to the delegate washroom." "I know, but the delegate washroom has radiant heating in the floor. It doesn't need the portable unit. This does." The maintenance worker hesitated, then nodded and disappeared down the service tunnel. The human woman Ashai turned back to the utility chamber, and Dreth saw what she was tending. An egg. A single egg, perhaps half the size of a Ketharin egg but unmistakably draconic smooth-shelled, with a faint pearlescent sheen that caught the corridor's bioluminescent light. It was sitting in an improvised nest made from what appeared to be a kitchen towel folded into a ring, placed inside a shallow cooking pan that had been repurposed as a warming tray. The pan sat on a low shelf in the utility chamber, surrounded by cleaning supplies and maintenance tools, in a space that had clearly never been intended to house anything alive. Dreth stood very still. His breathing, already labored, slowed further as he suppressed the instinctive increase in respiratory rate that surprise triggered. He watched the human woman adjust the towel around the egg, tucking the edges closer with the careful, practiced motion of someone who had done this many times before. Her hands moved with the particular gentleness that Dreth had seen only in experienced keepers, the ones who understood that the pressure of a touch on a shell was not merely physical but communicative, that the embryo inside could feel the difference between a hand that was performing a task and a hand that was present. She checked something on the egg's surface, running her fingertips along the shell's meridian, the way a keeper would check for stress fractures, and then sat back on her heels and simply looked at it. Her expression was not one of worry or duty or professional concern. It was the expression of someone keeping company, staying because staying was the thing that mattered. Dreth recognized the expression. He had seen it on Matriarch Salvan's face 300 years ago in the drafting chamber, when the old matriarch had spoken about why a living keeper was necessary. He turned away before the human noticed him and continued down the corridor to his quarters. His quarters occupied a corner suite in the Conclave's eastern wing, with windows that faced the morning sun. The room was sparse by Conclave standards, a sleeping platform sized for his body, a low desk where he kept his correspondence tablets, a water basin, and a shelf of archive volumes that he had been meaning to organize for 30 years and probably never would. The windows were tall, unshuttered, and the morning light that came through them was the one thing about the room that Dreth still found beautiful. Not the view was of the Conclave's formal gardens, which were well-maintained and thoroughly uninteresting. The light itself, the way it moved across the limestone floor through the day, warm and gold in the morning, cool and blue in the afternoon, and at dusk a deep amber that made the old stone look alive. He lowered himself onto his sleeping platform, the motion accompanied by the series of small cracks and adjustments that his joints now required for any significant change in position. He lay on his right side, his folded wing pressed against the wall, his damaged left wing resting across his flank. He closed his eyes and listened to his own breathing, the wet rattle, the pause between inhale and exhale that was fractionally longer than it had been last season. He thought about the egg. He thought about who it might belong to, and how it had come to be in a utility chamber in the service corridor of the galaxy's oldest legislative body, tended by a kitchen worker whose name was embroidered on her tunic. He thought about the maintenance worker's hesitation. He thought about the improvised nest, a kitchen towel in a cooking pan, the resourcefulness of someone making do with what they had because what they needed was not available through any official channel. He thought about Provision 14. Then he fell asleep, and the morning light moved across the floor without him. He woke in the early afternoon to a knock at his door, 3 measured taps, spaced evenly, the protocol knock that indicated a formal communication from the Conclave's administrative office. He rose, opened the door with a press of his foreclaw on the latch mechanism, and found a junior administrator holding a sealed message tablet. The message was brief. The amendment to Provision 14 had passed, 41-17. The new automated monitoring protocols would take effect at the beginning of the next legislative session. The administrator waited while Dreth read, then bowed the shallow, efficient bow of a functionary who respected the office more than the individual and left. Dreth set the tablet on his desk and stood at his window for a long time. The formal gardens below were empty except for a pair of maintenance workers pruning a grove of ornamental trees. The trees were a native species silver-barked, with broad, flat leaves that caught the sunlight and held it, so that the grove appeared to glow from within. Dreth had watched these trees grow. He remembered when they had been saplings, thin as his four-leg claws, staked against the wind with cord. Now they were mature, their canopies interlocked, their roots invisible beneath the garden's groomed surface, spread wide, and deep enough to crack the limestone foundations of the conclave if the gardeners ever stopped managing them. A living system that looked ornamental but was, underneath the surface, powerful enough to break stone. He made a decision. Not a dramatic one. Not the kind of decision that involved raising his voice in the chamber or calling an emergency session or invoking ancient procedural authorities. Dreth had spent 400 years watching those kinds of decisions fail. The dramatic gesture was satisfying, and it was almost always too late. The work that mattered was quieter, slower, and required a different kind of strength. The strength to do a small thing correctly, in the right place, at the right time, and trust that it would hold. He left his quarters and walked back to the service corridor. The egg was still there. The portable heater had arrived, a squat, cylindrical unit placed beside the shelf, its output directed at the cooking pan with a precision that suggested the human woman had spent considerable time adjusting the angle. The towel nest had been supplemented with a second towel, this one folded into a windbreak that blocked the draft from the corridor junction. The temperature in the utility chamber was noticeably warmer than the surrounding corridor. The human woman was not present. Dreth moved carefully into the utility chamber, his body filling most of the available space, and lowered his head to examine the egg. It was healthy. The shell's pearlescent surface showed no stress fractures, no calcification, no discoloration. The meridian line was clean and well-defined. When he pressed his auditory membrane, the sensitive tissue behind his jaw that Cathari used for subsonic detection against the air near the shell, he could feel the faint, rhythmic pulse of a heartbeat. Strong, steady, alive. He pulled back and studied the arrangement. The cooking pan, the towels, the heater, the shelf placement elevated away from the floor's cold, protected from the draft. The whole setup was improvised, unauthorized, invisible to anyone who did not walk the service corridors, and it was working. The egg was alive because someone had chosen to keep it alive, using whatever they had in a space that no one was watching. He heard footsteps, light, flat-soled, human. The woman came around the corner carrying a tray from the Conclave's kitchen, her own dinner, it seemed, a simple plate of food and a flask of water. She saw Dreth's bulk filling the utility chamber and stopped. Her expression did not show fear. It showed the careful assessment of someone who had spent years working around large Cathari in enclosed spaces and had learned to read body language before making assumptions. "Counselor Varn," she said. Her voice was steady. She knew who he was. "Asha," he said. He kept his voice low, in the subsonic register that humans perceived as warmth rather than authority. "Tell me about the egg." She set her tray down on a maintenance cart and stood with her hands at her sides. Not defensive, patient. the posture of someone who had been expecting this conversation and had already decided to tell the truth. "It was in the East Garden," she said, "3 weeks ago, buried in the leaf litter under the silverbark grove. The gardeners found it during their seasonal pruning and reported it to the facilities office. The facilities office flagged it for the territorial register. The territorial register kicked it back because the Conclave grounds are not classified as clan territory, so the egg falls outside the jurisdiction of any existing keeper program. It has no registered clan, no recorded brood mother, no legal status. So it was scheduled for disposal. Recycling. The facilities office requisitioned a mineral reclamation team. Routine. Standard processing within 72 hours. But the 72 hours passed. Asha met his gaze. Her eyes were brown, steady, and very tired. "I took it before the team arrived, hid it here. I've been keeping it warm on my shifts." "For 3 weeks." "Yes." "Does anyone know?" "2 maintenance workers. They bring the heater and check the power coupling when I'm not here. They haven't reported it." "Why not?" "I asked them not to." "Why did you take the egg?" She did not answer immediately. She looked at the egg in its towel nest, and the expression that crossed her face was the same one Dreth had seen that morning, the expression of someone who was not performing care but inhabiting it, the way a body inhabits breathing. "Because someone had to," she said, "and no one else was going to." Dreth looked at the egg, then at the woman, then at the improvised warmth system that was keeping a life alive in the blind spot of an institution that had just voted to replace keepers with sensors. "I need to know the clan markings," he said. "May I?" She nodded. He lowered his head until his auditory membrane was centimeters from the shell and listened. Not to the heartbeat, he had already confirmed that. He listened deeper to the subsonic register of the embryo's developmental signature, the frequency pattern that was as unique to each clan lineage as a fingerprint. It took him nearly a minute. The pattern was faint, masked by the egg's isolation from clan harmonic resonance, but it was there. His breath caught. The wet rattle in his lungs hitched, and he coughed a sound like gravel shifting in a dry riverbed. He steadied himself and pulled back. "What is it?" Asha asked. "Varn," he said quietly. "The lineage frequency is Varn." She stared at him. "Your clan." "My clan has not produced a viable egg in 90 years. I was told the line was closed." He looked at the small, pearlescent egg in its kitchen towel nest. "It appears someone was wrong." The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind of silence that holds the weight of a life-changing direction, the way a river holds the weight of the current when it reaches a bend and finds that the channel goes somewhere it had not expected. Dreth straightened. The motion cost him. His cervical vertebrae popped in sequence, and his left wing ached where the fused joint bore the weight of his adjustment. But his eyes were clear, and when he spoke his voice carried the full subsonic register, the deep harmonic that vibrated in the limestone walls and the metal shelf brackets and the teeth of every creature within 20 meters. "I am invoking Precedent 7 of the Founder's arbitration clauses," he said. "A counselor's direct claim right to any egg bearing their clan frequency, discovered on Conclave grounds, superseding administrative jurisdiction." Asha blinked. "Is that a real precedent?" "It is a very old one, older than Provision 14, old enough that no one in the current legislature has ever seen it invoked." He paused. "Old enough that it will take them considerable time to verify it, and while they are verifying, the egg remains under my legal guardianship, not subject to recycling, not subject to the facilities office, not subject to the new monitoring protocols." "How long will the verification take?" "If I file the claim correctly, and I have 400 years of procedural experience to ensure that I do, the verification process involves cross-referencing the Founder's original charter, which is stored in the Conclave's deep archive. which requires physical access authorization from 3 senior delegates, which requires a formal request period of no less than 30 legislative days. 30 days, during which the egg is mine, legally, physically, and without contestation. Asha looked at him. Her eyes, brown and tired and sharp, searched his face, his ancient, iron-scaled, white-seamed face, and found whatever she was looking for. "You planned this," she said. "You saw the egg this morning, and you planned this." "I saw you this morning," he corrected. "I saw someone staying with an egg that had no legal protector. I saw the thing that Provision 14 was built to ensure, and I realized that the provision was never the point. The provision was a structure. What it protected was the choice to stay when no one requires you to stay." He coughed again. The rattle was louder now, the effort of sustained speech drawing attention to the compromised tissue in his lungs. Asham moved toward him, not to help, because there was nothing to help with but to be closer. The instinct of a caretaker. "The egg needs to be moved to my quarters," Dreth said. "It needs proper thermal regulation, not a kitchen towel and a borrowed heater. I need you to help me build a nest, a real one. I can provide the specifications. You will need to find the materials through non-official channels, because the moment I file the precedent claim, every administrator in this building will be looking for procedural grounds to challenge it. I can do that. And I need you to continue caring for the egg when I cannot. My breathing limits the time I can spend in an enclosed space with another living body. The carbon dioxide concentration becomes problematic. I can do that too. This will not endear you to the facility's office. I cook soup for 600 delegates. The facility's office has never once remembered my name. Displeasing them would require them to notice me first." Dreth made a sound that was not quite a laugh, a low, subsonic vibration that resonated in his damaged chest cavity like a struck bell. It was the first time he had laughed in months. It hurt, and it was worth it. "They moved the egg that evening. Asha carried it herself, wrapped in the towels, cradled against her chest with both arms. Dreth walked beside her through the service corridors, his massive body screening her from view on one side, the corridor wall on the other. They moved slowly, his pace, which was the pace of a body that was running out of time and had learned not to waste what remained by rushing. His quarters were warm. The evening light through the tall windows had turned the limestone floor to amber, and the air held the particular stillness of a room that had been occupied by one body for a very long time. Asha set the egg on the sleeping platform and looked around. "The nest should go here," she said, pointing to the section of the platform closest to the window, where the morning light would reach it first. "The egg needs a thermal gradient warmer at the base, cooler at the apex. The shell will regulate the internal temperature as long as the external gradient is stable." Dreth watched her. "You know egg care. I raised 3 children on a colony freighter with a broken climate system. You learn to build a thermal gradient with whatever you have." She looked at the egg, then at him. "I also read a book, Tethrin's Introduction to Ketharin Territorial Biology. It was in the Conclave library. The chapter on incubation is very thorough." "You read Tethrin?" "I read everything in that library. I have worked in this building for 8 years. The kitchen closes at the 9th hour. The library is open until the 12th. I sleep at the 1st. That gives me 3 hours every night." Dreth settled onto his sleeping platform, arranging his body around the egg with the instinctive care of a species that had been nesting for millennia. The egg was small against his flank, absurdly small, a pearl beside a mountain. He could feel its warmth through his ventral scales, and beneath the warmth, the faint pulse of a heartbeat that carried the Varn frequency, the same lineage vibration that had resonated in his own shell 4 centuries ago. "There will be a challenge," he said. "Sulwan Oth will lead it. She is intelligent, procedurally gifted, and she will see this claim as a direct repudiation of her amendment. She will be right. It is. Can she overturn the precedent? The precedent itself, no. It is foundational law, but she can challenge the clan frequency identification. She can argue that my auditory membrane is compromised by age and stone lung, that the reading is unreliable. She can request an independent verification using modern equipment, which would involve removing the egg from my custody for the duration of the test. Would the test confirm the frequency? Almost certainly. The Varn signature is distinctive, but the test would take time, and during that time the egg would be in a laboratory, tended by technicians, monitored by equipment, not kept. What is the difference? He looked at her. You already know the difference. You have been living it for 3 weeks. She held his gaze, then nodded once. The next 2 days were a chess game played at the speed of bureaucracy. Dreth filed the Precedent 7 claim at the opening of the following morning's session, using the Conclave's oldest filing protocol, hand-inscribed on a limestone tablet, sealed with his claw mark, delivered to the clerk of records by personal carriage. The protocol was archaic, inefficient, and legally binding. It required the clerk to process the claim using the Founder-era verification procedures, which were slower, more cumbersome, and more difficult to circumvent than the modern digital filing system. Selwyn Oth's response came within 4 hours. A formal objection, filed electronically, citing 3 grounds. First, that Precedent 7 applied only to eggs discovered on traditional clan nesting grounds, not on Conclave administrative property. Second, that the counselor's identification of the clan frequency was not independently verified. And third, that the claim constituted a conflict of interest, as the counselor had a personal stake in the egg's lineage. The objection was well constructed. Each ground had textual support in the founder's charter. Each was narrow enough to be arguable and broad enough to be dangerous. Dreth had expected all 3. He spent the morning composing his responses, working at his desk with the egg visible on the sleeping platform behind him, its pearlescent shell catching the light from the eastern windows. His responses were detailed, precise, and deliberately slow. For each of Selwyn Oth's 3 grounds, he cited counter-precedents from the Conclave's archive, cases so old that the original rulings existed only as inscriptions on the Deep Archive's foundation stones, accessible only by physical inspection. The first counter-precedent addressed the definition of clan nesting grounds. Dreth cited Ruling 7 Call, in which the Second Conclave had determined that any location where a Ketharin egg was found in a natural state, that is, deposited by biological means, rather than transported, constituted de facto nesting grounds for purposes of keeper jurisdiction. The ruling was 460 years old. It had never been overturned. The second counter-precedent addressed the verification requirement. Dreth cited Ruling 12 Ethrin, which held that a clan elder's personal identification of a lineage frequency constituted prima facie evidence sufficient to establish custody, subject to later verification but not contingent upon it. The ruling recognized that a clan elder's auditory membrane, trained over centuries to recognize their own lineage frequency, was a more sensitive instrument than any manufactured device. The ruling was 310 years old. The third counter-precedent addressed the conflict of interest. Here Dreth deployed the most elegant of his arguments. He cited Ruling 22 Solvon, named for the same matriarch Solvon who had drafted Provision 14, which held that a clan elder's personal stake in an egg of their lineage was not a conflict of interest but a duty of care. The ruling explicitly stated that the elder's personal connection to the egg was the mechanism by which the founder's charter ensured that disputed eggs received attention that no administrative system could replicate. He filed all 3 counter-precedents on limestone tablets, using the same archaic protocol. Each tablet required separate processing. Each processing cycle took a minimum of 12 hours. The effect was cumulative. Sulwan Oth's objection could not proceed to a formal hearing until all three counterprecedents had been processed, verified, and either accepted or rejected by the clerk of records. It would buy him time, not indefinitely but enough. But Sulwan Oth was not waiting passively. By the second afternoon, she had counterfiled on each of his 3 tablets, a procedural maneuver that Dreth had anticipated but hoped she would not attempt, because it doubled the processing queue and forced the clerk into a cascade of cross-verification that would consume most of the remaining week. More dangerously, she had circulated an informal memorandum to the 5 voting bloc leaders, framing the precedent claim as a constitutional question rather than a custodial one. The framing was shrewd. If the bloc leaders accepted it, the hearing would be elevated from a records office proceeding to a full conclave floor debate, which would compress Dreth's timeline from 30 days to 5. 2 bloc leaders accepted. Dreth learned this from the junior administrator who brought his evening correspondence. The young Kethari lingered at the door after delivering the tablets, his tail shifting in the unconscious rhythm that indicated discomfort with a message he wished he did not have to carry. "Counselor," he said, "the clerk has scheduled the hearing 5 days." Dreth nodded. 5 days, less time than he had hoped, more time than he needed. Meanwhile, Asha built the nest. She appeared at his quarters each evening after the kitchen closed, carrying materials she had acquired through a network that Dreth found quietly remarkable. A thermal blanket requisitioned from the medical wing, listed on the supply log as replacement bedding for a delegate's quarters. A heating element borrowed from the kitchen's backup warming cabinet, the kind used to keep serving dishes at temperature during formal dinners. A shallow basin of polished stone, sourced from the maintenance workshop, originally intended as a replacement for a cracked fountain in the formal gardens. She assembled the nest on his sleeping platform with the methodical care of someone who was solving an engineering problem with limited resources. The stone basin formed the base dense enough to hold heat, smooth enough to protect the shell. The thermal blanket lined the basin, creating an insulating layer. The heating element sat beneath the basin, its output regulated by a manual dial that Asha checked and adjusted 3 times during each visit, her fingers testing the temperature of the stone and the air above the egg, with the same focused attention that Dreth had seen in the service corridor. On the second evening, while Asha was adjusting the thermal blanket, Dreth told her about matriarch Sulwan. He did not mean to. He had not spoken of Sulwan in decades. But the evening light was amber on the limestone floor, and the egg pulsed faintly in its nest, and the woman who was keeping it alive was doing so with the same quiet conviction that the ancient matriarch had carried, and the memory came unbidden, like a current that had been running beneath the surface for 300 years and finally found a crack in the stone. She was blind, he said, completely blind for the last 40 years of her life. The calcification had spread from her lungs to her optical membranes, a progression the healers had never seen before. She navigated the conclave by memory and subsonic echo. She knew every corridor, every chamber, every stairwell by the way her voice bounced off the walls. Asha sat on the edge of the sleeping platform, her hands resting in her lap. She did not prompt him. She simply listened, with the particular quality of attention that Dreth recognized as rare and valuable, the kind of listening that made the speaker feel that their words were landing somewhere that would hold them. She drafted Provision 14 because she remembered a clutch she had lost. His voice had dropped to the lowest register, barely above subsonic. Before the conclave, before the territorial system, when the clans still settled disputes by force and a displaced mother's eggs were considered spoils. Sulwan had been a young matriarch and her clan had been driven from their nesting grounds during a territorial war. She fled with a clutch of 4. She found shelter in a neutral territory, a merchant's compound at the edge of the disputed zone. The merchant was not Ketharin. He was human. Ashaz's hands, resting in her lap, went very still. The merchant did not know what the eggs were, Dreth continued. He had never seen Ketharin eggs. He did not know their value, their significance, the politics attached to them. He knew that a large, exhausted, wounded creature had arrived at his door with 4 objects that she guarded with her body, and that she was afraid. What did he do? He gave her a room, heated it, brought water. Left food outside the door because she would not eat while he was present. He did not ask questions, did not report her presence, did not contact any authority. He simply kept the room warm and the food coming and the door between her and anything that might find her. How long? 41 days, until the eggs hatched, until Solvan was strong enough to fly again. Dreth's breathing caught, the rattle louder for a moment before he controlled it. The merchant never knew what came of the clutch. Solvan went back to find him years later after the territorial wars had ended and the first conclave had been established. The compound was gone. The merchant was gone. She never learned his name. She carried the debt for the rest of her life. And she put it into the provision. She put it into every provision she ever drafted. The keeper requirement, the 48-hour response window, the prohibition on relocation during active care, all of it, was Solvan's attempt to encode into law the thing that the merchant had done by instinct. The choice to stay. The choice to keep a room warm for a stranger who was afraid. The amber light had deepened. The egg pulsed. Ashaz's hands in her lap were open, palms up, in the unconscious gesture of someone who was holding something invisible. I am going to lose the procedural challenge, Dreth said. Solwyn Oth is smarter than I am, younger than I am, and she has the institutional support that I used to have. My counter-precedents will delay her, not stop her. Eventually the clerk will schedule a hearing, and at the hearing she will argue that a 400-year-old counselor with compromised lungs and a fused wing is not a suitable guardian for a disputed egg. And the chamber will agree because they are thinking about efficiency, and I am thinking about a blind matriarch and a merchant who kept a room warm. Then what? Then I need the egg to have a keeper who is not me, someone who has been caring for it, who can demonstrate continuous, competent care, who has no clan affiliation and therefore no conflict of interest, someone whose only motivation is that they chose to stay. Ashaz stared at him. The realization arrived slowly, like sunrise, not a flash, but a gradual illumination that changed the color of everything in the room. You are asking me to be the keeper. I am asking you to continue doing what you have already been doing. The only difference is that it will be official. Under Precedent 7, a clan elder may designate a keeper of any species for an egg in their custody. The designation requires no approval from the facility's office, no endorsement from the territorial register, no credential beyond the elder's personal judgment. I am a cook. You are the person who took an egg from a recycling queue and kept it alive in a utility closet for 3 weeks using kitchen towels and a borrowed heater. The qualifications I need are not on any certificate. The third morning came with rain. Not the dramatic storm rain that rattled the conclave's ancient shutters and filled the drainage channels, but a quiet, persistent rain that softened the light through the eastern windows to a pale gray gold and filled the air with the smell of wet limestone. Dreth woke to the sound of it and lay still for a long time, feeling the egg's warmth against his flank and listening to the pulse of the heartbeat within. His breathing was worse. The night had been difficult, long stretches of shallow, inadequate respiration, punctuated by coughing fits that left his chest aching and his vision swimming. The stone lung was accelerating. The calciumite crystals were spreading faster now, the way they did at the end, the body's mineral processes losing the last of their regulation and depositing crystal in every available tissue. He had perhaps days, perhaps a week, not the seasons the healers had estimated at his last examination. The effort of the past 2 days, the filing, the counter-precedents, The sustained subsonic speech had cost him more than he had expected. He rose carefully. The egg was fine. The nest was holding temperature. The heating element hummed softly, and the thermal blanket held its shape, and the stone basin was warm to the touch. Asha arrived at the 7th hour, earlier than usual. She carried a tray from the kitchen, not food for herself, but a flask of hot water infused with sulfur compound minerals that Dreth had mentioned, eased the crystal tension in his pleural membranes. He had mentioned it once, in passing, during a conversation about the egg's thermal requirements. She had remembered. "You look worse," she said, setting the flask on his desk. "I am worse." "How much worse?" He considered lying. The instinct was old and deeply embedded, the Ketharin reflex to project strength, to keep the herd from seeing the individual's weakness, to maintain the subsonic frequency of authority even when the body beneath it was failing. He had spent 400 years maintaining that frequency. It had sustained him through legislative defeats, personal losses, and the slow erosion of relevance that came with outliving everyone who remembered why you mattered. But Asha was not the herd. She was a human woman who had stolen an egg from a recycling queue and read Tethran's textbook in a library at midnight, and remembered, from a single conversation, that sulfur compound minerals eased the crystal tension in his lungs. "I will not see the hearing," he said. "It does not matter. The counter-precedents will force the process forward regardless of my presence. Sulwyn Oth will challenge the Keeper designation. You will need to defend it." "How?" "By being in the room, by having your hands on the egg, by being the person who stayed." The rain continued through the morning. Dreth filed his final procedural document, a formal Keeper designation, inscribed on limestone in the founder's script, naming Asha of the Conclave kitchen staff as Keeper of the Varn egg under Precedent 7. He sealed it with his clawmark and had it delivered to the Clerk of Records by the junior administrator who had brought him the Provision 14 vote results 2 days earlier. The administrator looked at the tablet, looked at Dreth, and performed a bow that was deeper and slower than the one he had offered before. In the afternoon, Dreth returned to the upper gallery for the last time. The chamber was in session. The regular business of the conclave, trade arbitration, mineral rights disputes, the slow machinery of interspecies governance. Below, Sulwyn Oth sat in the 3rd row, her emerald scales catching the light from the clear-story windows, a stack of procedural tablets on the desk before her. She was reviewing something, her eyes moving with the quick precision of a mind that processed information the way a blade processed material efficiently, without waste. Dreth did not watch her, he watched the light. It came through the eastern clerestory in wide, golden panels, the same light that had been falling through those windows since the conclave was built, the same light that had illuminated Matriarch Salvan's blind face while she dictated the Keeper clause, the same light that would continue to fall long after the limestone had worn smooth, and the galleries had emptied, and the last delegate who remembered why any of it mattered had stopped breathing. The light did not care about provisions or precedents or amendments. The light simply came every morning because that was what light did. It showed up. It stayed. It fell on whatever was beneath it without judgment or condition, warm and gold and indifferent to whether anyone was watching. He stood in the gallery for an hour, feeling the light on his iron-dark scales, feeling the slow pulse of his heartbeat in his fused wing and his stiff joints and his crystallizing lungs, feeling the particular weight of a body that had been carrying 400 years of memory and was nearly ready to set it down. Then he went back to his quarters, where the egg was pulsing in its nest, and Asha was sitting beside it, reading Tethran's textbook by the gray-gold light of the rain, and the room smelled of wet limestone and warm stone, and the faint sulfur of a body that had been breathing in this space for a very long time. "Tell me what happens," she said, not looking up from the book. He settled onto the sleeping platform. The egg was between them, between his ancient, iron-scaled flank and her calloused human hands. He could feel its heartbeat and hers, two rhythms at different frequencies, both alive, both steady. Solwyn Oth will file an emergency motion to void the Keeper designation, he said. She will argue that a non-Ketharin cannot hold Keeper status under Foundera law. She will be procedurally correct. The Founder's Charter does not explicitly include non-Ketharin species in its Keeper provisions because, at the time of its drafting, no non-Ketharin species was present in Ketharin territories. Then how does this work? Ruling 22 Solvan. The ruling Solvan drafted after she returned from the merchant's compound and could not find him. The ruling does not specify species. It specifies qualities. A keeper, under Solvan's definition, is any individual who demonstrates continuous, voluntary, competent care of an egg without mandate, compensation, or expectation of return. The ruling was deliberately written to be species neutral because the person who had inspired it was human. Asha closed the book. She looked at the egg, then at him. She knew, Asha said. She wrote it for someone like me. She wrote it for someone exactly like you. She just did not live long enough to see you arrive. The rain eased. The light through the windows shifted from gray gold to something warmer, and for a moment the room held the particular quality of a space where two living beings are simply present with each other, without agenda, without performance, without the need to be anything other than what they are. Dreth coughed. The rattle was deep, and it did not stop quickly. When it passed, he tasted mineral on his tongue, the calciumite crystals, ground fine by the spasms, carried up from his lungs on the last useful air. The hearing will happen in 5 days, he said. I will not be there. I know. You will be. Yes. Bring the egg. Let them see you holding it. Let them see the nest you built and the care you have given. Do not argue. Do not cite precedents. Do not try to match Solwyn Oth's procedural expertise. Simply be the person who stayed. And that will be enough. Dreth looked at the egg. Its pearlescent surface caught the shifting light, and for a moment the shell seemed to glow from within, the bioluminescent pulse of a developing embryo responding to the warmth, the safety, the steady presence of beings who had chosen to be here. Solvan spent 300 years trying to build a system that could replace the merchant, he said. Provision 14, the Keeper clauses, the arbitration frameworks, all of it was her attempt to encode kindness into procedure, to make the choice to stay into something that could be mandated and measured and enforced. Did it work? For a while. And then the provisions were amended, and the mandates were streamlined, and the keepers were replaced by censors, and the system did exactly what systems always do when you remove the person from the center of them. It continued to function perfectly while losing the capacity to care. He closed his eyes. The rain had stopped entirely now, and the late afternoon light through the windows was the deep amber that made the old stone look alive. The merchant did not have a system, he said. He had a room. He had warmth. He had the willingness to keep showing up. That is what you have. It has always been enough. It was enough before Solvan wrote her provisions, and it will be enough after every provision has been amended into nothing. Asha placed her hand on the egg. Not adjusting, not checking, not performing any task, just resting it there. Her palm flat against the pearlescent shell, her fingers curled gently around the curve, her calloused skin against the smooth surface. The egg pulsed beneath her hand. The heartbeat was stronger now, perceptibly stronger than it had been 3 weeks ago in the utility closet. The embryo was growing. It was responding to the warmth, the stability, the presence. It was alive because someone had chosen to keep it alive, and it knew. Dreth watched her hand on the shell, and he felt something shift in the deep register of his chest, not the rattle, not the crystal, but something older, something that had been there since before the stone lung and the fused wing and the 400 years of legislative patience. a feeling that did not have a word in Catherine or in any human language he knew, but that he understood the way he understood the Varn frequency, not through learning but through recognition. The feeling of a debt being settled. Not his debt to the egg, or the egg's debt to Asha, or Solvan's debt to the merchant. The larger debt. The one that runs beneath all the others. The current that connects the merchant's warm room to Solvan's provision to the kitchen towel in the utility closet to this moment. This amber light. This hand on this shell. The debt that says, someone chose to stay, and because they stayed, something lived. On the evening of the third day, Dreth Varn, counselor of the Conclave, 412 years old, last of the Varn clan, stopped breathing. He was on his sleeping platform, with the egg against his flank and the amber light on the floor and the smell of wet limestone in the air. Asha was beside him. She had not left since the afternoon. She had known, the way that people who spend their lives caring for living things always know, that the rhythm was changing, that the pauses between breaths were stretching beyond the point where the next breath was certain. The last rattle came and went, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of the subsonic resonance of 400 years of memory settling into the limestone, full of the pulse of the egg's heartbeat, full of the amber light that continued to fall through the windows without judgment or condition. Asha kept her hand on the egg. She did not move. She stayed. 5 days later, she carried the egg into the conclave chamber for the hearing. She wore her kitchen tunic, the one with the faded fabric and the name embroidered on the breast pocket. She carried the egg in the stone basin, cradled against her chest, the thermal blanket folded around it. She walked through the main gallery doors, not the service corridors, and every delegate in the chamber turned to look. Sulwyn Oth rose. Her emerald scales caught the morning light from the clerestory. She was beautiful, precise, and entirely prepared. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Sulwyn Oth presented her arguments careful, correct, procedurally impeccable. She cited the charter, the amendments, the precedents, the counter-precedents. She addressed the species question, the verification question, the conflict of interest question. She was thorough, and she was right about almost everything. When it was Asha's turn, she did not argue. She set the stone basin on the gallery rail where Dreth had stood 3 days earlier, and she said, "This egg has a heartbeat. It has had one for 26 days. I have been listening to it every night. I am not a keeper by credential. I am a keeper because I stayed." The chamber was silent. The morning light fell through the clerestory windows in wide, golden panels. The dust motes drifted. The egg pulsed. 41 delegates pressed their markers into the limestone tally grooves. The vote was 34-7. The keeper designation held. Sulwyn Oth remained standing after the vote. Her expression was not defeat. It was the careful, assessing look of a mind that had encountered a variable. It had not modeled not a flaw in the argument, but a force outside the argument. A current that precedent and procedure could not contain or redirect. She looked at the egg in its stone basin, at the human woman standing beside it in a kitchen tunic, at the empty gallery rail where Dreth Varn had stood for the last time. Then she sat down. The egg hatched 11 days later in the amber light of Dreth's quarters, with Asha's hands cupped around the shell as the first crack appeared. The hatchling was small, iron-scaled, with the white-seamed growth lines of the Varn lineage visible even in its first minutes. It opened its eyes clear, unfogged, the deep copper of healthy Catherine youth, and looked at Asha with an expression that held no fear, no confusion, and no uncertainty. Only recognition. The recognition of a creature meeting the warmth that had kept it alive and knowing it. Asha held the hatchling in her calloused hands, against her kitchen tunic, in the room that smelled of limestone and sulfur, and the long, patient breath of something that was gone. The hatchling's first sound was a low, subsonic pulse, barely audible, more felt than heard. It vibrated in the limestone walls and the stone basin and the glass of the windows and the bones of Asha's hands. The Varn frequency. The same note that had resonated in Dreth's chest for 400 years, carried forward now in a body that was hours old and already knew, in whatever way that life knows these things, that someone had chosen to stay. Asha listened to it and felt the pulse settle into the spaces between her own heartbeats, and she understood, in the way that understanding comes when it is too large for words, that the debt was not settled and never would be. It was not meant to be settled. It was meant to be carried. Carried forward from the merchant's warm room to the matriarch's provision to the kitchen worker's hands, each carrier holding it for a time and then passing it on. The way light passes through a window and falls on whatever is beneath it, warm and gold and indifferent to whether anyone is watching, and always, always enough.